There's a mistake almost everybody makes when dealing with avoidant people. And the mistake feels logical. You think, if I just explain myself clearly enough, if I show them how much I care, if I send one more message, maybe if I disappear completely and block them, but avoidants are not reacting to your words the way secure people do. They react to pressure. And pressure is not always aggressive. Pressure can sound loving. Pressure can sound emotional. Pressure can sound understanding. But if the emotional intensity feels too high, avoidants experience connection as a threat to their autonomy. That's the part most people never understand. Avoidants are not usually running from you. They are running from the feeling of emotional dependency. The moment they sense expectations, emotional demand, urgency, or loss of control, their nervous system starts looking for distance. And here's where people accidentally destroy attraction. They start chasing harder the moment the avoidant pulls away. More texts, more emotional explanations, more reassurance, more fixing the relationship. But emotionally, that feels like pursuit, and pursuit activates escape. Now here's the strange paradox. The more emotionally controlled you become, the more psychologically visible you become to an avoidant. Not because you're manipulating them, because you stop triggering their defense system. That changes everything. See, most avoidants are used to emotional chaos. They expect people to react dramatically. They expect guilt tactics. They expect emotional flooding. They expect anger, panic, and desperation. So when somebody suddenly becomes calm, grounded, and self-contained, it interrupts their pattern recognition. Their brain starts asking, why aren't they chasing? Why don't they seem emotionally dependent anymore? What changed? And curiosity is powerful, much more powerful than pressure. This is why don't text first is not a game. If you're using silence as manipulation, they'll eventually feel that. Real emotional detachment looks different. You stop monitoring their behavior every hour. You stop trying to decode every message. You stop building your emotional stability around their attention. You become emotionally harder to destabilize. And that's the shift avoidants notice immediately. Because avoidants pay attention to emotional energy more than words. Most people think attraction is created through communication. But for avoidants, attraction is often created through emotional safety. And emotional safety means no pressure, no emotional flooding, no constant demands for reassurance. Now let's talk about blocking. Blocking feels powerful in the moment because it gives you immediate emotional control. But psychologically, blocking can communicate unresolved emotional intensity, especially if it's done impulsively. To an avoidant, it often confirms their deepest fear. Relationships become emotionally overwhelming. So instead of blocking, disappear emotionally. That's different. You don't need revenge. You don't need dramatic exits. You don't need speeches. You simply redirect your energy back into your own life. And here's what becomes fascinating. When you genuinely stop emotionally chasing an avoidant, one of two things happens. Either they slowly re-engage because the pressure disappeared, or you finally see clearly enough to stop idealizing them. Both outcomes are victories. But most people never reach that stage because they stay emotionally trapped in reaction mode. They're cons, tantly responding emotionally instead of observing strategically. And emotional reactions are predictable. Predictability lowers psychological tension. But calm detachment creates uncertainty. Now understand something important. Avoidants are extremely sensitive to emotional contrast. If you used to chase, explain, overtext, and emotionally pursue, and suddenly you become centered, focused, calm, and less reactive, they feel the difference instantly, even if they never admit it. Because now the emotional dynamic changed. You're no longer pulling on them emotionally. And when pressure disappears, avoidants often feel safe enough to reconnect. But this only works if the detachment is real, not performative. You cannot fake inner stability. People always leak emotional neediness through timing, tone, social media behavior, indirect posts, passive aggression, and emotional inconsistency. Real detachment has silence in it. Real detachment has peace in it. And the most attractive thing to an avoidant is often someone who is emotionally complete without demanding constant closeness. Now here's the deeper lesson nobody talks about. The goal should never be, how do I am? Ache the avoidant comeback? That mindset keeps you psychologically dependent. The real goal is, How do I become emotionally stable regardless of who stays or leaves? That changes your entire nervous system. And ironically, that's usually when avoidants start returning. Because emotionally healthy distance feels safer than emotional pursuit. Most avoidants don't trust intensity. They trust consistency. They trust calmness. They trust people who don't collapse emotionally the moment connection changes. And when you stop trying to force emotional certainty from them, you become psychologically different in their eyes. Not because you played a game, because you stopped participating in the anxious-avoidant cycle. That cycle survives on reaction. You text, they pull away. You panic, they withdraw more. You chase harder. They emotionally shut down. But when one person becomes emotionally grounded, the pattern breaks. And that's the moment power returns to your life. Not power over them, power over yourself. Because self-control is psychologically magnetic, especially in a world where most people are emotionally impulsive. And the truth is, the moment you no longer, everyone needs to validate your worth, you stop behaving in ways that push them away. That's the irony. The less emotionally dependent you become, the more emotionally safe you feel to them. And whether they return or not, you win. Because now your emotional state belongs to you again. One of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidance is believing they fear distance. In reality, avoidants usually fear emotional pressure far more than physical space. Distance often feels safe to them because it gives them room to regulate their emotions privately, without feeling overwhelmed by expectations, emotional intensity, or demands for closeness. What truly activates an avoidance defense system is not necessarily love itself, but the feeling of being emotionally cornered. The moment they sense pressure, obligation, urgency, or emotional dependency, their instinct is often to pull away, sometimes suddenly and without explanation. This is why many people become confused in relationships with avoidance. The more affection, reassurance, or emotional energy they give, the colder the avoidant may appear to become. To the person pursuing connection, this reaction feels irrational. They think, I'm showing love, so why are they becoming distant? But avoidants often interpret intense emotional pursuit differently. Instead of feeling comforted, they may feel trapped. Their nervous system begins associating connection with pressure rather than safety. Even healthy communication can feel emotionally heavy if they believe it comes with expectations they may not know how to meet. What makes this dynamic even more complicated is that emotional pressure does not always look aggressive. It can come disguised as care, concern, or constant attempts to fix the relationship. Repeated texting, long emotional conversations, asking for reassurance, demanding clarity, or trying to force emotional openness can all unintentionally increase an avoidant's need for escape. The avoidant may not consciously think, this person is controlling me. Instead, they simply feel emotionally overloaded. Their mind begins searching for relief, and distance becomes the fastest form of emotional regulation. This is why chasing an avoidant after they withdraw usually backfires. Most people respond to distance by increasing effort. They text more, explain more, apologize more, or try harder to reconnect emotionally. But to an avoidant, this increase in emotional intensity often confirms their fear that relationships lead to pressure and loss of independence. The more emotionally pursued they feel, the more their walls go up. It becomes a cycle where one person seeks closeness while the other seeks relief from emotional intensity. Ironically, avoidants often feel safest around people who are emotionally grounded and self-contained. Calmness lowers their defenses because it removes the sense of obligation they fear. When someone stops emotionally chasing them, the avoidant no longer feels trapped or responsible for managing another person's emotional state. That emotional freedom can create space for curiosity, reconnection, and trust. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional energy, and they notice when someone becomes less reactive, less needy, and more emotionally stable. Understanding this changes the entire approach to avoidant relationships. The goal is not to suppress emotions or play manipulative games. It is to recognize that emotional pressure and emotional safety are very different things. Healthy love cannot grow in an environment where everyone feels emotionally hunted. Real connection happens when both people feel free rather than emotionally cornered. For avoidance, safety often begins the moment pressure disappears. One of the hardest lessons people learn in relationships with avoidance is that silence often carries more psychological power than emotional pursuit. Most people instinctively believe that problems are solved through more communication, more explanations, and more emotional effort. When an avoidant begins pulling away, the natural reaction is to chase clarity. People start sending longer texts, asking emotional questions, trying to fix misunderstandings, or searching desperately for reassurance. But with avoidance, this constant emotional pursuit usually creates the exact opposite effect of what is intended. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional intensity. The more emotionally pursued they feel, the more their nervous system starts interpreting the relationship as overwhelming. What feels like love or concern to one person can feel emotionally invasive to an avoidant. Repeated texting, constant checking in, emotional speeches, or reacting to every shift in their behavior creates pressure they struggle to regulate internally. Instead of feeling closer, they begin associating the relationship with emotional exhaustion. Their instinct becomes escape, not connection. This is why silence can become psychologically powerful. Silence removes pressure. It interrupts the emotional cycle that avoidants expect from people. Many avoidants are used to others reacting strongly when distance appears. They expect anger, panic, emotional explanations, guilt, or desperate attempts to reconnect. When those reactions do not happen, something changes psychologically. The avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered. Their nervous system has space to breathe, and emotional tension begins decreasing rather than increasing. Silence also creates mystery and uncertainty, which can shift the emotional dynamic completely. Constant emotional pursuit makes your feelings predictable. The avoidant knows you will always chase, always explain, always react. Predictability lowers curiosity, but calm silence changes the emotional atmosphere. It forces the avoidant to notice the absence of pressure. Instead of feeling emotionally hunted, they begin wondering why the emotional intensity disappeared. That curiosity is often far more impactful than endless attempts to force communication. However, silence only becomes powerful when it is genuine. Silent treatment used as manipulation usually carries hidden emotional aggression underneath it. Avoidance can often sense when silence is performative or designed to provoke guilt. Genuine silence is different. It comes from emotional self-control, not emotional punishment. It happens when someone stops obsessively monitoring the avoidance behavior and redirects focus back onto their own life. The energy changes completely because the silence is no longer about control, it is about emotional balance. This does not mean communication is unhealthy. Healthy communication matters deeply in secure relationships. But with avoidance, timing and emotional intensity matter just as much as words. Constant emotional processing can overwhelm someone who already struggles with vulnerability and closeness. Silence gives emotional space where pressure once existed. It allows emotions to settle naturally instead of being forced into immediate resolution. What makes silence especially powerful is that it communicates emotional independence. When Mione stops reacting impulsively. They appear emotionally stronger and more stable. Avoidants are often drawn toward people who feel emotionally self-contained because those people feel safer. Emotional pursuit can unintentionally signal dependency, while calm silence signals self-respect and emotional control. In many cases, the moment people stop chasing an avoidant is the moment the avoidant starts paying attention again. Not because they enjoy games, but because the emotional pressure finally disappears. Silence breaks the anxious-avoidant cycle by removing the constant emotional pursuit that fuels withdrawal. And in that quiet space, clarity, curiosity, and sometimes reconnection finally have room to exist. Blocking someone can feel powerful in the moment, especially after emotional confusion, rejection, or distance. For many people, it feels like taking control back after feeling ignored or emotionally hurt. But when dealing with avoidance, blocking often sends a message that carries far more emotional intensity than people realize. Instead of creating clarity or healthy distance, it can unintentionally reinforce the avoidant's deepest fears about relationships. That emodio. Now closeness eventually becomes overwhelming, chaotic, or emotionally explosive. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional pressure and emotional volatility. They often associate intense emotional reactions with danger rather than connection. Because of this, blocking can feel less like healthy boundaries and more like emotional escalation. Even if the person blocking intends it as self-protection, the avoidant may interpret it as anger, emotional unpredictability, punishment, or an attempt to force a reaction. This interpretation strengthens their instinct to withdraw further because it confirms the belief that relationships eventually become emotionally unmanageable. What makes blocking especially complicated is that it is rarely emotionally neutral. Most people do not block others from a calm, detached emotional state. Blocking usually happens during moments of hurt, frustration, resentment, or emotional overload. The avoidant often senses that emotional intensity behind the action, even without words being exchanged. To someone who already fears emotional engulfment or conflict, this level of emotional energy can feel deeply uncomfortable. Instead of feeling drawn back to hard connection, they may feel relief in creating even more distance. There is also a psychological difference between setting quiet boundaries and making dramatic exits. Quiet boundaries communicate emotional stability. Blocking, especially when done impulsively, can communicate unresolved emotional pain. For avoidance, unresolved emotional intensity often activates escape behaviors because they struggle with emotional confrontation and pressure. They may interpret blocking as proof that emotional closeness always leads to dramatic reactions, emotional unpredictability, or loss of control. Another reason blocking can backfire is because it keeps the emotional dynamic highly charged. Even though communication stops, the emotional energy remains intense underneath the surface. Blocking often says, "I need you to know how hurt I am," even when no words are spoken. Avoidants are extremely sensitive to these emotional undercurrents. They may not consciously analyze them, but their nervous system reacts to the pressure. Instead of seeing emotional safety, they see emotional consequences attached to closeness. This does not mean people should tolerate unhealthy treatment or avoid boundaries. Boundaries are necessary and healthy. But there is a major difference between calm detachment and emotionally reactive control. Calm detachment says, "I am focusing on my peace and emotional well-being." Reactive blocking often says, "I am overwhelmed, angry, or emotionally flooded." Avoidants usually respond far better to emotional calmness than emotional intensity because calmness lowers their defensive instincts. Ironically, emotionally withdrawing your attention without dramatic actions is often more powerful than blocking. When someone quietly redirects their energy into their own life, they are able to focus on their goals and priorities, and make progress towards achieving their dreams. Stops emotionally chasing and becomes less reactive. The avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered. The relationship dynamic loses its emotional chaos, which is exactly what avoidants fear most. In many cases, blocking is less about healing and more about emotional reaction. And avoidants tend to interpret strong emotional reactions as confirmation that intimacy leads to instability. That is why emotional self-control, quiet boundaries, and genuine detachment often create more psychological impact than dramatic exits ever could. One of the most powerful psychological shifts that can happen in relationships with avoidance is the moment emotional self-control replaces emotional pursuit. Most people believe attraction grows through constant reassurance, emotional availability, and persistent communication. But avoidants often respond differently. They are highly sensitive to emotional intensity, pressure, and predictability. When someone reacts emotionally to every change in connection, the avoidant quickly learns the pattern. They know exactly what to expect. More texts, emotional explanations, anxiety, or attempts to pull them closer. Over time, that predictability can make the relationship feel emotionally heavy rather than emotionally safe. Emotional self-control changes the entire dynamic because it interrupts those expectations. When someone becomes calm, grounded, and emotionally centered, the avoidant notices immediately. The energy feels different. Instead of emotional chasing, there is emotional steadiness. Instead of reactions driven by fear, there is patience and quiet confidence. That shift creates something extremely powerful in human psychology: curiosity. Avoidants often become curious when emotional pressure disappears because they are nervous. System no longer feels cornered. They begin wondering what changed. The person who once reacted strongly is suddenly calm. The person who constantly sought reassurance is now emotionally stable. This unpredictability, when healthy and genuine, breaks the emotional pattern the avoidant had grown accustomed to. Human beings naturally pay attention to changes in emotional behavior, especially when those changes feel emotionally grounded instead of manipulative. What makes emotional self-control so effective is that it communicates inner security. Avoidants are often more comfortable around people who appear emotionally independent because independence feels safer than emotional dependency. When someone's emotional state no longer revolves around the avoidant's attention, it removes the feeling of obligation and pressure. The avoidant no longer feels responsible for regulating another person's emotions, and that creates emotional breathing room. In that space, curiosity can grow naturally. This does not mean becoming cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. Healthy unpredictability is not emotional manipulation. It is the natural result of someone becoming more focused on their own. In life, goals, peace, and emotional stability. They stop reacting impulsively. They stop monitoring every text or social media interaction. Their attention shifts inward instead of constantly chasing emotional certainty from another person. That emotional independence becomes noticeable because it changes the entire emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Avoidants are especially sensitive to emotional contrast. If someone who was once anxious, reactive, or emotionally dependent suddenly becomes calm and self-contained, the contrast stands out strongly. The avoidant may start asking themselves questions internally. Why do they seem different? Why aren't they chasing anymore? Are they moving on emotionally? This curiosity often creates more emotional engagement than pressure ever could. The avoidant begins observing instead of escaping. There is also a deeper psychological truth behind emotional self-control. Calmness signals strength. In emotionally charged situations, most people become reactive, impulsive, or desperate for immediate answers. Someone who remains emotionally grounded during uncertainty appears emotionally resilient. That resilience creates respect because it demonstrates self-worth and emotional maturity. Avoidants who often fear emotional chaos tend to feel safer around people who can regulate themselves calmly. The irony is that people often become most attractive to avoidance when they stop trying to force connection. Emotional self-control removes pressure while increasing emotional mystery. It allows the avoidant to experience the relationship without feeling trapped by emotional demands. And sometimes, the moment someone truly lets go of emotional chasing is the moment the avoidant finally becomes emotionally attentive again. One of the biggest changes that transforms relationships with avoidance is the shift from emotional attachment to emotional independence. Many people unknowingly build their emotional stability around the avoidance behavior. Their mood depends on replies, attention, affection, or signs of reassurance. When the avoidant becomes distant, anxious energy immediately rises. They begin overthinking, chasing clarity, seeking validation, or trying harder to reconnect emotionally. But avoidants are extremely sensitive to this kind of emotional dependence, even when it is subtle. The moment they sense someone emotionally needs reassurance from them to feel secure, pressure begins building inside the relationship. Avoidants often struggle with feelings of emotional obligation. When they feel responsible for constantly reassuring someone, their nervous system starts associating connection with pressure instead of freedom. What many people see as normal emotional closeness can feel emotionally consuming to an avoidant. This is why the more attached and reassurance-seeking someone becomes, the more distance the avoidant often creates. They are not always rejecting the person themselves. They are reacting to the emotional weight they feel inside the dynamic. This is why shifting your energy toward independence changes everything psychologically. Emotional independence means your emotional state is no longer controlled by another person's attention or validation. It means you stop making someone else the center of your emotional stability. Instead of constantly seeking reassurance, you begin building peace within yourself. Your focus shifts back toward your own growth, purpose, routines, friendships, goals, and emotional well-being. This creates a completely different emotional atmosphere around you. Avoidants notice this shift quickly because the emotional pressure starts disappearing. When someone no longer needs constant validation, the relationship feels lighter and safer. The avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered or responsible for managing another person's emotional security. Independence removes the unspoken demand that often exists beneath anxious attachment. Without that pressure, avoidants often become more relaxed and emotionally open because the connection no longer feels like an emotional obligation they must constantly maintain. There is also something psychologically attractive about emotional independence. People who are grounded within themselves tend to appear calmer, more confident, and emotionally stable. They are not constantly reacting to uncertainty or seeking emotional rescue from others. That emotional steadiness creates safety, especially for avoidants who fear emotional chaos and dependency. Independence communicates, "I value connection, but I am still emotionally complete on my own." That message feels very different from emotional attachment that says, "I need your reassurance to feel okay." What makes this shift powerful is that it changes behavior naturally. When someone becomes emotionally independent, they stop obsessively checking messages, analyzing silence, or reacting impulsively to distance. They stop over-explaining themselves or chasing emotional certainty. Instead, they become more patient and emotionally balanced. The avoidant notices this because the relationship dynamic no longer feels emotionally heavy. Curiosity often replaces avoidance because there is finally room for emotional breathing space. Ironically, avoidants are often more drawn toward people who are capable of emotionally letting go. Not because avoidants dislike love, but because they fear losing freedom, autonomy, and emotional control. Someone who demonstrates emotional independence feels safer because they do not appear emotionally consumed by the relationship. This lowers defensive instincts and allows connection to feel more voluntary instead of emotionally forced. The deeper truth is that emotional independence benefits everyone, not just avoidant relationships. The moment your peace no longer depends on another person's reassurance, you reclaim emotional power within yourself. You stop chasing validation and start iving from stability. And in many cases, that is the exact moment avoidants begin responding differently, because the emotional pressure they feared is finally gone. One of the most important truths people misunderstand in avoidant relationships is that healthy detachment is not manipulation. Too many people approach emotional distance as a strategy to force someone back, gain power, or trigger guilt. They try to win the relationship by acting cold, ignoring messages intentionally, or pretending not to care. But avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional inconsistency and hidden pressure. Manipulation still carries emotional intensity underneath it, even when disguised as silence. Real change only happens when the goal shifts away from controlling the other person and toward building emotional stability within yourself. The anxious-avoidant cycle survives on emotional reactions. One person seeks reassurance and closeness, while the other seeks distance and relief from emotional pressure. The more anxious one person becomes, the more avoidant the other often becomes. Then the anxious person reacts even harder to the distance, creating even more withdrawal from the avoidant. Over time, both people become trapped in a repeating emotional pattern where neither person actually feels safe. One fears abandonment, while the other fears emotional overwhelm. This is why healthy detachment changes everything. Healthy detachment is not about pretending you do not care. It is about no longer allowing your emotional state to be controlled by another person's inconsistency. Instead of reacting impulsively to every text, silence, or shift in behavior, you begin regulating yourself calmly. You stop chasing emotional certainty. You stop trying to force connection, force clarity, or force reassurance. That emotional steadiness interrupts the cycle because you are no longer feeding it with anxious reactions. Avoidants often expect emotional pursuit when they pull away. They anticipate repeated messages, emotional conversations, demands for reassurance, or dramatic reactions. These patterns reinforce their belief that relationships are emotionally exhausting. But when someone responds differently with calmness, patience, and self-control, the emotional atmosphere changes completely. The avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered. The relationship starts feeling less threatening because the pressure has been removed. What makes healthy detachment powerful is that it comes from inner stability rather than emotional games. Manipulation always focuses on controlling someone else's emotions. Emotional stability focuses on managing your own. That difference matters deeply because avoidants can often sense when someone is trying to provoke a reaction. Silent treatment, jealousy tactics, indirect social media behavior, or calculated distance still create emotional tension. Healthy detachment feels different because it carries peace rather than hidden anger. When someone becomes emotionally stable, they stop revolving their life around the avoidance behavior. They redirect energy toward themselves, their goals, their routines, their health, and their emotional growth. They stop obsessively analyzing every interaction. This naturally lowers emotional pressure inside the relationship because the avoidant no longer feels responsible for managing another person's emotional security. Ironically, this emotional stability often creates the conditions where avoidants feel safest reconnecting, not because they are being manipulated, but because the dynamic itself becomes healthier. Calmness feels safer than emotional intensity. Independence feels safer than emotional dependency. Stability feels safer than unpredictability and emotional chaos. The deeper lesson is that healthy detachment is not really about getting the avoidant back. It is about breaking free from emotional reactivity altogether. Once someone becomes emotionally grounded, they stop losing themselves inside the relationship dynamic. Whether the avoidant returns or not, the emotionally stable person no longer lives in constant anxiety or emotional pursuit. That is the real transformation. The power is no longer in controlling someone else's behavior. The power is in finally controlling your own emotional responses. And when that happens, the anxious avoidance cycle loses the fuel that kept it alive for so long.